You are the shame of this family, Rachel. Get out of my house. My father shouted those words at me in front of everyone at Thanksgiving dinner. His hand hit the table, the silverware shook, and the whole room went quiet. My mother looked down and said nothing. My brother wouldn't even lift his eyes from his plate. My sister smirked like she was glad it finally happened. I stood there with my son beside me, his little hands clutching mine. He was scared and confused, and I had no way to explain why his own grandfather wanted us gone. I walked out that night knowing something was finished for good. They thought I was nothing, but they had no idea I was worth $94 million, and that the truth I had hidden was about to change everything. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family, or been treated as if your worth didn't matter, this story is for you. Stay with me until the end, because what started as the worst Thanksgiving of my life turned into the moment I finally found my freedom. Before I take you through everything that happened, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Hidden Family Revenge Stories, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story of betrayal, justice, and powerful revenge. Now, let me tell you how it all began. Thanksgiving has always been complicated for me. People say it's a holiday about gratitude, about family coming together, but for me it always felt like walking into a stage where I was the wrong actor in the wrong play. Every year I told myself maybe this time would be different. Maybe they would see me for more than the black sheep. And every year I ended up leaving with the same heavy feeling in my chest. Last Thanksgiving was no different, at least not at first. My parents' house in Charleston looked like the picture of tradition. The white columns, the wraparound porch, the oak trees out front strung with lights. It all gave the impression of warmth and belonging. Inside, the house smelled of roasted turkey, cinnamon pies, and pine-scented candles my mother always bought in bulk. Anyone walking in would think it was the perfect family gathering, but I knew better. I knew what it meant to walk down that hallway lined with family portraits, every smiling face a reminder of how little space there was for me in this family. My brother Daniel had his graduation photos framed at every turn. Caroline, my younger sister, had her wedding portrait enlarged and centered above the fireplace. And then there was me, tucked into the corners, the forgotten middle child who didn't fit their mold. I brought my son Ethan with me, dressed in his best shirt because I wanted him to feel proud, to feel included. He was 7, curious and always full of questions. I could see in his eyes the excitement of a holiday he thought was about love and laughter. I didn't have the heart to tell him it was different for us. My father, Richard Monroe, was already in his chair when we walked in. He had the kind of presence that filled a room, not because of kindness, but because of control. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it was usually for Daniel. My mother, Margaret, hovered in the kitchen, fussing with the food, avoiding eye contact the way she always did when she was nervous. Daniel and his wife, Rebecca, had arrived earlier with their kids. Daniel was polished, confident, every word he spoke dripping with pride about his latest case at the law firm. Rebecca sat beside him like his perfect shadow, chiming in with little comments about their twins and their new house in Charlotte. Then there was Caroline. My sister never missed an opportunity to remind me that she had done things right. Her husband sat quietly next to her, smirking whenever she took a jab at me, as if humiliating me was part of the entertainment. I tried to push down the knot in my stomach and told myself to focus on Ethan. He deserved to feel like he belonged here, even if I didn't. But the moment I looked around that dining room, the shining silverware, the neatly folded napkins, the careful seating arrangement, it was clear. I wasn't really a guest at this table. I was the mistake they had to tolerate for one more holiday. We sat down to dinner around 3 o'clock. My mother had laid out her best china, polished until it shone under the light, as if perfection on the table could hide the cracks between us. Ethan was placed at the little card table off to the side with the twins. He looked so proud of himself in his button-up shirt, even when he immediately dropped cranberry sauce on it. I smiled and helped him clean it off, but no one else even looked his way. The main table was packed. Daniel sat across from me, already pulling out his phone to check something before the first plate was even passed. Rebecca leaned close to him, whispering about the twins' new soccer schedule, loud enough for the rest of us to hear. Caroline was seated at the other end, her husband beside her, both of them watching me like I was the evening's entertainment waiting to begin. The conversation started with Daniel, of course. It always did. He cleared his throat and launched into a story about his recent promotion, how the firm had trusted him with a big corporate case. Everyone nodded and praised him. My father even managed a rare smile, the kind he never gave me. I tried to join in when there was a pause, sharing a light story about Ethan and the neighbor's dog. He'd tried to teach the dog how to skateboard and ended up tumbling into the grass, laughing until his stomach hurt. I thought maybe someone would at least chuckle, but the table stayed silent. Daniel returned to talking about his client, Rebecca corrected some detail for him, and Caroline smirked into her wine glass like my words didn't matter. The silence after I spoke burned worse than any insult. It was a reminder that in this family, I was invisible. I looked at my mother, hoping for even the smallest encouragement, but she only shifted nervously and busied herself passing the breadbasket. Then Caroline leaned forward, her voice sweet but sharp. "At least Ethan keeps you busy," she said, tilting her glass. "I don't know how you manage on your own." I mean, most people would have figured out life by 34. Her husband chuckled under his breath, and my father gave a grunt that felt more like agreement than disapproval. I felt the heat rise in my face, but forced to smile, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Ethan looked over from his little table as if sensing the tension, and I quickly smiled at him, pretending everything was fine. Inside, though, I could feel the air tightening around me, the walls closing in. By the time the turkey was carved and plates were filled, I knew what was coming. I could see it in my father's eyes every time he glanced at me, the way his jaw clenched, the way his fingers drummed against the tablecloth. He had been waiting for this moment, and so had everyone else. It happened faster than I expected. 1 second, everyone was eating in silence. The next, my father's fist came down on the table with a crack that made the silverware jump. My mother's wine glass tipped over, spilling red across the white cloth like a stain no one could hide. Ethan startled at the sound, his little fork dropping onto his plate with a clatter. My father's face was red, his voice booming across the room. "You're a disgrace, Rachel. A single mother at your age, dragging this family down every time you walk through that door." No one said a word. Daniel's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Rebecca lowered her eyes. Caroline leaned back, smirking as if she had been waiting for this very moment. Her husband gave a small laugh under his breath, cruel and careless. I could feel the blood rush to my cheeks, but I forced myself to stay still. My father's words weren't new to me. He had said them in private before, but never in front of everyone like this. Never with my son sitting just a few feet away, watching. He wasn't finished. "We gave you every chance to make something of yourself," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "And what did you do? You chose this life. You embarrass us every time you show up here." I looked at my mother, desperate for even the smallest defense, but she only twisted her napkin tighter, eyes locked on her lap. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, like he wanted to say something but didn't dare. Caroline sipped her wine slowly, her smile widening, feeding off my humiliation. Ethan's eyes filled with confusion and fear. He looked at me, searching for reassurance, and I reached under the table to squeeze his hand. I wanted to protect him from every word being thrown like stones, but there was nowhere to hide. Then my father stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Get out. You are not welcome in this house anymore. Not until you fix your life. Not until you stop being a burden to this family." The room was silent except for the crackle of the fireplace. I felt every eye on me, waiting to see if I would beg, if I would cry, if I would make a scene. But I didn't give them that. I stood slowly, my hands steady as I gathered Ethan's coat. He clung to me, whispering, "Mom, why is Grandpa so mad?" His little voice cut deeper than anything my father had said. I kissed the top of his head and told him it was time to go. No one stopped me. No one said goodbye. It was as if they had been waiting for this, as if my exit had always been part of the evening's plan. As I stood there, slipping Ethan's small arms into his jacket, the weight of silence pressed down heavier than my father's words. No one moved to stop me. Not my mother, not Daniel, not Caroline. Their silence stung more than the shouting. It was a choice. They had chosen to let me walk away branded as a failure. But deep inside, I felt something else rising. Anger. Not the wild kind, but the sharp, steady anger that comes from years of being erased. My father's words rang in my ears. "We gave you everything." And in that moment, all I could think was how wrong he was. I remembered the checks I had sent every month, quietly covering the mortgage when they had fallen behind. I remembered the tuition payments for Daniel's law school, payments he thought came from some scholarship fund. I remembered the car in my father's driveway, the one he bragged about to his friends as if it was a gift from his years at the power company. He had no idea it had been me. And then there was Caroline. She had cried to me in secret about not being able to have children, about the cost of treatments. I had written the checks without hesitation, wanting her to have the family she dreamed of. Tonight she sat smirking while her husband mocked me, as if my life was the real shame. Every memory cut deeper, but it also sharpened something inside me. For years I had let them believe I was the weakest one, the mistake, the disappointment. And maybe it was easier that way. Easier than explaining the long nights, the missed meals, the endless hours I had poured into building something from nothing. Ethan tugged on my hand, his eyes wide and wet. I knelt down to his level, brushing the hair from his forehead, whispering that everything would be all right. My voice didn't shake. For the first time in years, I felt steady, almost calm. I rose again, looking around the table one last time. Daniel's eyes dropped to his plate. My mother dabbed at the spilled wine, pretending not to see me. Caroline leaned back in her chair, smug, and my father stood there, chest heaving, convinced he had finally put me in my place. But what none of them knew, what none of them had ever bothered to ask, was that their lives, the house, the cars, the comfortable dinners they enjoyed, were all tied to me. To the money they thought appeared from nowhere. To the woman they were now throwing out. I felt the anger settle into something colder, something unshakable. This wasn't just humiliation. This was the moment I realized I had been feeding the very hand that struck me. I pulled Ethan's jacket zipper all the way up to his chin, then slipped his toy truck into his pocket because I knew he wouldn't leave it behind. His small hand clung to mine like it was the only safe place left in that room. I straightened my back, took a slow breath, and turned toward the door. Not one person spoke. The clinking of silverware had stopped, the fire crackled in the background, and still the silence hung heavier than anything else. It was the kind of silence that told me everything. I didn't belong here, and maybe I never had. I walked to the hallway closet to grab our coats. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor, each step echoing through the house I had secretly kept standing. The house they were so proud of. The house that would not even exist without me. Ethan looked up at me with worried eyes. Mom, are we in trouble? He whispered. My throat tightened, but I bent down and kissed his forehead. No, sweetheart. We're going home, I told him. I turned back once, just for a second. My mother was still staring at the napkin in her lap, her hands shaking. Daniel kept his gaze fixed on his plate, refusing to meet my eyes. Caroline leaned against her chair, sipping her wine, her smirk carved deep into her face. And my father, he stood tall, arms crossed, proud of what he had done, as if shaming me in front of everyone had somehow restored his honor. But the truth was, this wasn't the end for me. It was the end for them, because the moment I stepped out that door, I knew I was finished hiding. Finished letting them believe I was the weakest one in the room. The cold November air hit my face as I opened the door. Ethan squeezed my hand tighter, and together we walked down the porch steps. I helped him into his booster seat, tucked the blanket around him, and then stood there for a moment, staring back at the house. I thought I would feel broken. I thought I would cry. But instead, I felt something else. Something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. They thought I was nothing. They thought I was the burden, the mistake, the one who never measured up. But they had no idea. No idea that the life they lived, the comfort they enjoyed, the very roof over their heads was tied to me. And they had no idea I was worth $94 million. That night wasn't just the end of Thanksgiving. It was the beginning of the truth. When I walked out of my parents' house that night holding Ethan's hand, I couldn't stop thinking about how far I had come from the girl they believed I still was. They saw me as a failure, but the truth is, I had already lived through the lowest point of my life and rebuilt myself from the ground up. 5 years earlier, I was 29, newly single, and pregnant. The father of my child had disappeared the moment responsibility entered the picture. I was left standing in a drafty apartment on the edge of Denver with a baby on the way, a secondhand laptop on the table, and just enough money for 2 more months of rent. I remember staring at the peeling paint on the walls, wondering how I had ended up here. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have savings. What I had was fear. Fear of failing. Fear of raising a child alone. Fear of becoming exactly what my father always said I would be. Nothing. That fear could have paralyzed me. But instead, it pushed me. One rainy Saturday afternoon, I sat at that kitchen table with my laptop and a notebook full of messy scribbles. I kept coming back to the same thought. I had always loved art, design, and handmade things, and I knew so many talented people who struggled to find buyers. At the same time, I was desperate to build a life that didn't depend on anyone else. Out of that desperation came an idea. A digital marketplace where independent artists could sell their work. I called it Harbor Lane. The name came from a picture I'd seen once of a quiet harbor at sunset, a place that looked safe and steady. That was what I wanted to create. A harbor for artists and a harbor for myself and my son. The first steps were clumsy. I didn't know how to design a website, but I stayed up all night watching tutorials. I didn't know anything about marketing, but I read free blogs and tested ideas until something worked. I wrote product descriptions while balancing my swollen feet on a chair, Ethan kicking inside me, reminding me that I wasn't just building this for me. Most days I was terrified. I would look at my bank account and wonder if I'd have to choose between paying for diapers or keeping the lights on. But in the middle of that fear was something else. Determination. I wasn't going to crawl back to my parents and prove them right. I wasn't going to let my son grow up thinking his mother had no strength. Looking back now, that tiny apartment with its leaky windows and secondhand furniture was the place where everything began. It was where I decided that if the world wasn't going to give me a seat at the table, I'd build my own table. And one day, they'd see. Starting Harbor Lane gave me hope, but the reality of building something from nothing was brutal. Every day felt like climbing a mountain with no summit in sight. Ethan was born in the middle of it all. I still remember bringing him home from the hospital, laying him in a secondhand crib I had picked up from a thrift store, and then sitting back down at my laptop a few hours later. Other mothers had help from parents or husbands. I had a crying newborn and a website that barely worked. The first year was chaos. I would nurse Ethan at 3 in the morning, then answer customer emails until the sun came up. I learned to type with one hand while holding him with the other. The website crashed constantly. Orders came in late, and sometimes products were lost in shipping. Angry messages filled my inbox, and every refund felt like a personal failure. Money was always tight. There were days I opened the fridge and counted what was left like it was gold. Half a carton of eggs, some milk close to expiration, and a jar of peanut butter. I remember one night when Ethan was barely a year old, and I only had enough money for either diapers or the electricity bill. I chose diapers and spent the next week working by candlelight, praying he wouldn't notice the cold. And yet, giving up never felt like an option. Every time I thought about closing the laptop and admitting defeat, I'd look at Ethan's face as he slept, his tiny chest rising and falling, and I knew I had to keep going. I taught myself everything because I couldn't afford help. Web design, customer service, taxes, advertising. I studied them all through free YouTube videos and blog posts. I made mistakes constantly, but each one taught me something. I learned how to write copy that caught attention. I learned how to package orders so they wouldn't break in shipping. I learned to stretch every dollar until it screamed. Sometimes I felt like the world was laughing at me. Old friends stopped checking in. Neighbors whispered about the single mother who was wasting her time with some silly online shop. Even my own family, when I tried to share small victories, would brush it off. Maybe you should think about getting a real job, Rachel. Daniel had once told me over the phone, his voice dripping with condescension. What they didn't know was that Harbor Lane was my real job. It was my survival. It was my fight against the future they had already written for me. Every night, after Ethan was asleep, I'd sit in that little apartment with my laptop glowing in the dark and whisper to myself, one more day. Just get through one more day. And somehow, that was enough to keep moving forward. The second year of Harbor Lane didn't start much better than the first. Sales were inconsistent, my website still looked amateur, and every week felt like a gamble on whether I could cover rent. But then, something happened that changed everything. One morning, I opened my inbox and saw an unfamiliar name. A popular lifestyle blogger had stumbled across Harbor Lane and written a glowing review, calling it a hidden gem for authentic, handcrafted art. I didn't even know about it until I saw the spike in orders. Dozens in a single day, then hundreds by the end of the week. My tiny apartment was suddenly buried in boxes, packing tape, and shipping labels. I barely slept. Ethan, now a toddler, played on the floor beside me while I wrapped orders late into the night. My kitchen table became a shipping station, and my living room looked like a warehouse. But for the first time, exhaustion felt different. It wasn't despair. It was hope. Word of mouth spread. More bloggers and small magazines picked up the story. Artists from across the country began reaching out, asking if they could list their work on Harbor Lane. I went from begging people to give me a chance to turning down submissions because I couldn't keep up. By the third year, Harbor Lane wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Retailers in New York called, asking if I would consider collaborations. A design firm in Los Angeles wanted exclusive rights to sell certain collections. Even a fashion house in Paris emailed me about a capsule partnership. I remember reading that email twice, certain it had been sent to the wrong person. My revenue tripled, then quadrupled. For the first time, I hired help. 2 part-time assistants who worked with me in shifts so I could finally sleep. I upgraded my website, streamlined operations, and watched the numbers climb. What had started as a desperate attempt to survive was becoming something bigger than I ever imagined. I still kept my life simple. I drove the same old SUV, wore the same jeans and sweaters, and answered my mother's phone calls like nothing had changed. I didn't brag. I didn't even tell my family the truth. To them, I was still the struggling single mom. It was easier that way. Or maybe I was still afraid they wouldn't believe me. But every time I looked at Ethan, running around our tiny apartment with a toy truck in his hand, I felt proud. He didn't know it, but he was growing up in the middle of something extraordinary. I wasn't just keeping us alive anymore. I was building a future. By the end of that third year, Harbor Lane's value had skyrocketed. My accountant sat me down and told me the number, and I almost laughed in disbelief. $94 million. It didn't feel real. The girl my father had called worthless was now running an empire. And still, no one in my family had a clue. By the time Harbor Lane reached its peak, I could have shouted the truth from the rooftops. I could have walked into my parents' house with bank statements, contracts, and headlines that proved every word my father ever said about me was wrong. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed quiet. I let them go on believing I was barely holding myself together. It sounds strange, but silence was easier. I told myself I was protecting them from jealousy, from questions, from truths they weren't ready to hear. But deep down, I think I was still the girl who wanted to keep the peace at any cost. So while they dismissed me, I funded their lives. When my parents were behind on the mortgage, it was my wire transfer that saved the house. I paid off the debt quietly through a shell company, letting them believe some generous church donor had stepped in. When Daniel went to law school and tuition bills piled up, I sent the checks each semester, disguised as anonymous scholarships. He bragged later about how lucky he was to find funding at just the right time. I smiled and said nothing. Caroline's situation was even more personal. She and her husband had struggled to have children. I remembered her voice breaking over the phone, begging for help, saying she didn't know what else to do. I wired the money for her treatments without hesitation. Months later, when she announced her pregnancy at the Thanksgiving table, everyone toasted to her strength and perseverance. No one toasted to me. Even my father, the man who had called me a disgrace more times than I could count, drove a car I had paid for. He loved telling his friends about how he'd earned it after years of hard work. The truth was, he hadn't earned it. I had given it to him. It became a pattern. I funneled money into their lives, patched up their problems, and erased their struggles while they went on believing I was the struggling one. And the cruelest part? They never once asked. They never once wondered where the help came from. Sometimes, late at night, I'd wonder what would happen if I told them. Would they finally respect me? Would they finally look at me and see more than the black sheep? But then I'd hear my father's voice in my head, or Caroline's smug laugh, and I knew the answer. Respect wasn't something I could buy. So I stayed invisible. I let them keep their pride, their illusions, and in exchange, I swallowed my own. It worked for years, until that Thanksgiving night. The night they pushed me out, unaware that the very life they were clinging to was built on me. That was the night the silence ended. That night, after leaving my parents' house, I drove Ethan home in silence. He fell asleep in the back seat, his small face still stained with tears, clutching his toy truck like it was the only thing steady in his world. My chest ached, but strangely, my hands on the wheel didn't shake. When we got home, I carried him upstairs, tucked him into bed, and kissed his forehead. For a long moment, I just stood there in the doorway, watching him breathe. He deserved better than what we had endured at that dinner table. He deserved to know his mother wasn't weak. I walked into the living room, opened my laptop, and stared at the financial dashboard on the screen. There it was, in black and white. The mortgage payments for my parents' house, the automatic transfers to Daniel, the quiet support for Caroline's medical bills, the maintenance fees for my father's car. Line after line, every number was proof that their lives were built on me. And yet, a few hours earlier, they had looked me in the eye and called me worthless. For years, I had accepted this role, the invisible benefactor, the quiet scapegoat. But not anymore, not after tonight. I hovered over the first transaction, the mortgage payment. My finger clicked cancel. Just like that, the house they worshipped was no longer under my protection. Next was Daniel's monthly deposit. Canceled. Caroline's medical support. Gone. My father's credit card linked to my account. Deactivated. One by one, I shut it all down. With every click, I felt the weight on my chest loosen. It didn't feel cruel. It didn't even feel like revenge. It felt like freedom. For the first time in years, I was no longer carrying people who had never carried me. I was no longer erasing their mistakes while they laughed at mine. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. The apartment was quiet. The only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator and Ethan's steady breathing down the hall. My whole body felt lighter. They thought they had ended something when they threw me out of that house. But in truth, they had started something. That night was the moment I chose myself. And as I sat in that small apartment with nothing but silence around me, I realized it was only the beginning of a new life. One where I no longer hid who I was or what I had built. After I shut down every payment that night, I knew there was no turning back. For the first time in years, I had cut the cord that tied me to a family who never saw me for who I was. But freedom is more than closing a laptop. It's choosing where to start again. And for me, that place was Hawaii. I had bought the beach house 2 years earlier, pretending it was just a small condo I used for business trips. In reality, it was everything I had dreamed of. A modern glass home facing the Pacific, with tall windows that caught the morning sun and a stretch of sand that felt endless. Back then, I told myself it was for someday. Now, someday had arrived. When Ethan and I landed in Honolulu, he pressed his face to the car window the whole ride from the airport. His little voice filled with excitement. "Mom, there's sand right outside the door," he squealed as soon as we stepped into the house. Watching him run circles around the living room, flinging open doors, tumbling onto the patio with the ocean stretched before him, it was the first time I saw pure joy wipe away the memory of that night at my parents' table. Our mornings quickly found a rhythm. I would brew coffee and wrap myself in a blanket while Ethan ran barefoot across the sand, building lopsided castles and chasing seagulls. The sun rose slowly over the water, painting everything in gold, and I would just sit there, breathing in the air, reminding myself this was real. No one was there to judge me for being a single mother. No one was waiting to pounce on my every move. There was just me, my son, and the sound of the waves. But even in those peaceful moments, the ghosts of Charleston lingered. Sometimes, as I watched Ethan laugh, I would hear my father's voice echo in my mind. "You are the shame of this family." I would remember Caroline's smirk, my mother's silence, Daniel's downcast eyes. The memories still hurt, but with every crashing wave, they seemed further away. At night, after Ethan fell asleep, I would sit on the balcony with a glass of wine. The sky melted into purple and gold, and the ocean whispered against the shore. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a life not built on pleasing others. I didn't have to be invisible anymore. I didn't have to hide my strength. Hawaii became more than a refuge. It was the beginning of who I really was. And as I watched Ethan's drawings pile up on the fridge, seashells collected in jars, and sunlight spilling across the floor, I knew. This was our home. Life in Hawaii gave me something I hadn't felt in years: space to breathe. For so long, every decision I made had been about survival. How to pay the next bill, how to keep Harbor Lane running, how to protect Ethan from the weight of a family that never wanted us. Now, for the first time, I could wake up without fear gnawing at me. The morning started with the sound of waves instead of my father's voice in my head. Ethan's laughter echoed through the halls, chasing away the silence that used to haunt me. We would walk along the shore collecting seashells, and he would hand me the smallest ones as if they were treasures. Each day, I felt myself healing in ways I didn't know I needed. But peace also brought reflection. At night, when Ethan was asleep, I would sit on the balcony with a notebook. I started writing again. Not business plans or financial projections, but pieces of myself I had buried. Memories of my childhood, the sting of being overlooked, the anger I carried for years. Putting it on paper was painful, but it was also freeing. I realized how much of my life had been spent proving my worth to people who never wanted to see it. Every sacrifice I made, every dollar I funneled into that family, had been about buying a seat at their table. And still, when it mattered, they told me to leave. It was then I knew I needed to do something different. Not for them, but for me, and for others like me. That's when the idea of a foundation took shape. I called it Harbor of Hope. Just like Harbor Lane had been a safe harbor for artists, this would be a harbor for mothers like me. Women who had been told they were failures. Women fighting to raise children alone. Women carrying shame that wasn't theirs to begin with. I poured myself into the planning. I researched grants, legal structures, partnerships. For the first time, I wasn't building something in the shadows. This was a mission I wanted the world to see. As I sketched the first outlines of the foundation, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't about revenge anymore. Not the kind my family would recognize. This was about reclaiming my voice, turning years of pain into power, and making sure no one else had to fight the way I did without support. Every step I took toward Harbor of Hope felt like stitching together the parts of me they had tried to tear apart. And with each stitch, I felt stronger. It was late afternoon when the call came. The sun was just starting to sink into the horizon, casting the ocean in shades of orange and pink. Ethan was on the patio, carefully lining up seashells like soldiers, and I was inside at my desk, drafting the first proposal for Harbor of Hope. When my phone buzzed and I saw my mother's name, I froze. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it. For weeks, I had lived without hearing their voices, without carrying their weight. But something in me hesitated, and I answered. Her voice was trembling. "Rachel, it's your mother." She didn't have to tell me she'd been crying. I could hear it in every syllable. "We need help. We're losing the house." "Your father? He's not well." "Caroline, she's desperate. The treatment's for her little boy. She doesn't know how she's going to pay." I stood there in silence, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. All the memories from that night at Thanksgiving came rushing back. The fist on the table, the words that cut me down, the silence of every person in that room. Part of me wanted to hang up, to protect the peace I had fought so hard to build. But another part of me, the daughter who had always carried their burdens, leaned in to listen. "Rachel, please," my mother whispered. "We didn't know. We didn't realize everything you've done for us. We thought it was luck or blessings. We didn't know it was you." Her words sliced through me. For years, I had stayed quiet, waiting for someone, anyone to ask, to notice. They never did. And now, only when the money stopped did the truth matter. I looked through the glass door at Ethan. He was laughing, holding up a seashell to the light, completely untouched by the storm on the other end of the line. That was when I understood. This wasn't just about them. This was about the boundaries I needed to protect for him and for me. Mom, I said slowly, my voice steady. Do you remember that night? The night Dad threw me out in front of everyone? That was the moment I stopped. That was the moment I chose myself. And I won't go back. She sobbed, trying to form words, but I didn't let her. For the first time, I wasn't the silent one. You all thought I was nothing, I continued. But I was the reason you had that house. I was the reason Daniel graduated. I was the reason Caroline had her child. And not one of you ever asked, ever thanked me. You don't get to erase me anymore. When I hung up, my hands were still steady. Outside, Ethan waved at me through the glass, smiling, asking me to come join him. And I did. That night, after I put Ethan to bed, the phone rang again. It was my mother. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me wanted to hear what she would say now. Her voice was raw from crying. Rachel, please. Your father is sick with worry. Daniel can't cover the debts. Caroline. She's terrified she'll lose her son's treatments. We didn't know it was you all along. We never understood how much you carried for years. Those were the words I wanted. To be seen, to be acknowledged. But hearing them now when they were desperate felt hollow. Where was this recognition when my father called me worthless? Where was it when my brother and sister sat silent while I was humiliated? I took a deep breath. Mom, listen to me carefully, I said, my voice calm, firmer than I ever thought it could be. Every single thing you just listed was me. I paid for the house. I put Daniel through law school. I gave Caroline the money for her treatments. Even Dad's car, the one he brags about. That was mine too. On the other end, silence. Then a choked sob. Rachel, why didn't you tell us? I closed my eyes, feeling years of pain rise in my chest. Because you never asked. You never wanted to see me as more than your disappointment. It was easier for you to believe I was nothing, so I let you. But that ended the night Dad threw me out. I let the silence stretch. It wasn't cruel. It was necessary. For once, the weight of the truth was on them, not me. If you want me in your life now, I continued, it won't be on your terms. I won't come back to beg for scraps of respect. If you want a relationship with me and with Ethan, it starts with one thing. Respect. Real respect. Not for the money, not for what I can give, but for who I am. My mother's sobs filled the line. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I was afraid of your father, afraid of making things worse. But I should have protected you. Her apology stung, but it was also the closest I had ever come to hearing the words I needed. Still, I knew it wasn't enough to erase years of silence. I don't hate you, Mom, I said softly, but I won't let you erase me again. Not now. Not ever. When the call ended, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for the family I had always wanted but never had, and relief that I finally said what should have been said years ago. I stepped out onto the balcony, the night air warm against my skin. The ocean roared in the distance, steady and unbothered. For the first time, I realized I wasn't waiting for their approval anymore. I didn't need it. A week after that call with my mother, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from my father. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, like he had struggled over every word. It wasn't long, just a single sentence. We miss you. We're proud. For years, I had dreamed of hearing those words. But when I read them now, I didn't cry the way I thought I would. Instead, I just sat quietly, holding the letter in my hands, realizing that even though it mattered once, it didn't define me anymore. Daniel reached out not long after, a clumsy phone call filled with small talk and half-finished sentences. He didn't know how to apologize, but the fact that he called it all was his way of admitting he finally saw me differently. Caroline, too, sent a message late one night. I was jealous of you, Rachel. I never said it. I should have. I'm sorry their words, their gestures might have meant everything to me once. Now they were simply pieces of closure. Because the truth was, I no longer needed their approval to feel whole. In Hawaii, life had taken on a new rhythm. Ethan thrived, sun-kissed skin, sandy hair, laughter that carried on the wind. He made friends at school, brought home drawings of palm trees and waves, and told anyone who asked that his mom was the bravest person in the world. Hearing that from him meant more than any apology my family could ever give. And Harbor of Hope? It became real. The first programs launched. Scholarships for single mothers, legal aid for women fighting custody battles, emergency funds for those abandoned with nowhere else to turn. I poured my pain into that foundation, and in return, it gave me peace. Sometimes I would stand on the balcony at dusk, Ethan leaning against my side, both of us watching the sun melt into the Pacific. And in those moments, I thought about how far I had come. From the girl who cried in a cramped Denver apartment, to the woman my father had tried to shame, to the person I was now. They thought I was nothing. They thought I was the burden, the failure, the shame. But they were wrong. I am enough. And I always was. A year had passed since that Thanksgiving night, and sometimes it felt like another lifetime. Hawaii had become home in every sense of the word. Ethan was taller now, braver too. He raced barefoot along the shoreline with new friends, his laughter blending with the sound of the waves. Harbor of Hope had grown faster than I imagined. What began as a handful of grants had turned into a network of programs across 3 states. I had spoken at conferences, met women whose stories mirrored mine, and each time I told them they weren't alone, I felt like I was healing right alongside them. Then one morning, as I was sorting through emails, I saw an unexpected subject line. From Dad. For a long time, I couldn't open it. My father had only written once before, that shaky letter with a single sentence. But now there were paragraphs. He admitted he had been wrong. He admitted his pride had blinded him, and that his silence had cost him the daughter he should have been proud of all along. He didn't ask for money, not even forgiveness. He simply wrote, I hope one day you can sit with us again, not as the shame, but as the daughter you always were. I read it twice, then tucked it into a drawer. Forgiveness wasn't simple. Wounds like mine didn't vanish with words on a page. But the fact that he had written it at all was proof that the truth had finally forced them to see me. That evening, Ethan found me on the balcony. Mom, he said, holding up a seashell he had painted with bright colors. This one's for you. It means strong, I smiled, pulling him into my lap. Do you know why it means strong? I asked. He shook his head. Because even when the ocean pushes against it every day, it doesn't break. It just becomes more beautiful. He grinned, proud of the answer, and I realized in that moment that he would grow up knowing strength not as anger, not as silence, but as resilience. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I thought about my father's letter, about the family I had left behind, and about the family I had built here with just me and Ethan. Maybe one day I would sit across from them again. Or maybe I wouldn't. But either way, my story was no longer about proving them wrong. It was about living right. And in that quiet moment, with the ocean stretching endlessly before us, I knew this was the true ending. And the true beginning. It was a warm evening in Honolulu, almost a year after that Thanksgiving. Ethan and I had just finished dinner when there was a knock at the door. At first, I thought it might be a neighbor, or one of the mothers from Ethan's school. But when I opened it, I froze. Caroline was standing there. Her eyes were tired, her once perfectly styled hair pulled back in a messy bun. She didn't look like the sister who used to smirk at me across the dinner table. She looked smaller, broken in a way I had never seen before. "Rachel." Her voice cracked. "I know I shouldn't be here." But I didn't know where else to go. Ethan peeked around my legs, curious. I told him gently to go play in his room, and when he was gone, I stepped aside. Against my better judgment, I let her in. We sat in the living room, the ocean breeze carrying through the open windows. Caroline twisted her hands in her lap. "After you cut everything off, it all fell apart. The house, the cars, Dad's health. I thought we could handle it, but I didn't realize how much of our lives depended on you. And She swallowed hard. "I treated you like dirt even when you were the one holding us together." For a long time, I said nothing. I just let her speak. "I was jealous," she admitted finally. "You had courage I didn't. You built something of your own while I clung to the family name. I thought if I tore you down, I could feel bigger. But it didn't work. It only made me smaller." The old Rachel might have melted at those words, desperate for her sister's approval. But I had changed. I looked at her, steady, and said, "Caroline, I don't hate you. But I won't carry you anymore. If you're here for money, the answer is no. If you're here to tell me the truth, then maybe that's a start." Tears filled her eyes. She shook her head. "I'm not here for money. I wanted you to know I'm sorry. And I wanted to see for myself that you're really happy." I nodded slowly. For the first time in years, there was no anger in my chest. Just a quiet understanding that some things could be acknowledged without being fixed. When Caroline stood to leave, she paused at the door. "You were never the shame, Rachel." I think deep down, we all knew that. We just couldn't admit it. I closed the door behind her and leaned against it, exhaling. Ethan came running in, holding a seashell he had painted. "Mom, look." "It's for you," I pulled him close, smiling. In that moment, I realized something important. Forgiveness didn't mean letting people back into your life. Sometimes it just meant letting go of the hold they once had on you. And as the waves crashed outside, I knew that chapter was truly closed. It was Ethan's first year at his new school in Honolulu, and they had a special event called Family Day. Parents were invited to listen as the kids shared short speeches about the people who inspired them most. I didn't think much of it. I assumed Ethan would talk about superheroes, or maybe his favorite teacher. When it was his turn, he walked up to the small stage, his hair sun-bleached from so many afternoons by the ocean. He clutched a note card in his hands, but when he started speaking, his eyes searched the crowd until they found me. "My hero is my mom," he said simply. The room grew quiet. My heart tightened. My mom works hard. She takes care of me. She makes sure I'm safe. She tells me I'm strong even when I don't feel strong. She doesn't have a husband to help her, but she never gives up. And she built something big, all by herself. She helps other moms too, so kids like me don't have to be scared. He paused, his little voice steady but full of conviction. "Some people didn't see how amazing she is. But I see it every day. And I want to be like her when I grow up." I felt the tears spill down my cheeks before I could stop them. For years, I had lived with the weight of being invisible, ignored by my family, dismissed by people who thought I would never make it. And yet, here was my son, standing in front of his entire class, making me more visible than I had ever been in my life. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. He hopped down from the stage, ran straight into my arms, and whispered, "Did I do good, Mom?" I hugged him so tight I thought my heart would burst. "You did more than good, Ethan. You reminded me why I fought so hard that night. After he fell asleep, I sat on the balcony watching the moonlight dance across the waves. I thought about my father's letter, Caroline's apology, all the years I had carried shame that wasn't mine. And I realized something profound. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about legacy. My family had tried to silence me, but Ethan's voice had broken through louder than any insult, stronger than any rejection. He saw me. And through him, I knew the story wasn't just about what I had lost. It was about what I had gained. They once called me the shame of the family. But Ethan's words proved the truth. I wasn't the shame. I was the foundation. And in his eyes, I was enough. More than enough. It was almost 2 years after that Thanksgiving when I got another call. This time, it wasn't from my mother or Caroline. It was from Daniel. His voice was low, almost broken. "Dad's in the hospital. If you want to see him, you should come." I didn't answer right away. For days, I carried the weight of that invitation. Did I owe him that? Did I owe myself that? Ethan noticed my silence, and one evening he asked, "Mom, are you scared to go?" I realized I wasn't scared. I was tired. Tired of carrying the version of me my father had created. So I went. The Charleston hospital was quiet when I walked in, the smell of disinfectant heavy in the air. Daniel met me in the hallway. He didn't try to justify anything, didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. He just said, "He's been asking for you." When I stepped into the room, my father looked smaller than I remembered. The man who had once slammed his fist on the Thanksgiving table now lay surrounded by beeping machines, his skin pale, his voice weak. His eyes found mine, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he whispered, "Rachel." Just my name. I stood by the bed, my arms folded, my heart caught between anger and sorrow. "You threw me out," I said quietly. "You called me the shame of the family in front of my son." His lips trembled. "I know. I was wrong. Too proud to admit it. Too blind to see you were the strongest of us all." His breath rattled. "I can't change the years I stole from you. But I want you to know, I see you now. I'm sorry." The apology came decades late, and yet, in that sterile room, it mattered more than I expected. Not because it erased the past, but because it freed me from waiting for words I thought I'd never hear. I leaned down, close enough that he could hear me. "I don't need your approval anymore. But I'll take your apology, and I'll carry it with me. Not as a weight, but as proof that even the hardest hearts can change." His eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in my life, I saw my father not as the man who had crushed me, but as a man broken by his own regrets. When I left the hospital, the air outside felt different. Lighter. Ethan slipped his hand into mine and asked, "How was Grandpa?" I looked at my son, the future I had built, and smiled softly. He finally told me the truth. And sometimes, Ethan, that's enough. Years later, long after the chaos of that Thanksgiving had faded into memory, Ethan was preparing to leave for college. The house in Hawaii felt quieter with every box we packed, each one carrying pieces of the life we had built together. One afternoon, while I was cleaning his room, I found a small wooden box tucked under his bed. Inside were seashells he had collected over the years, ticket stubs from movies, and a few folded pieces of paper. One of them was an envelope with my name on it, written in his uneven handwriting from when he must have been 8 or 9. I sat on the edge of his bed and unfolded the letter. "Dear Mom, I know sometimes you cry when you think I'm asleep. I hear you in the kitchen, and I want to tell you that you don't have to be sad. You're the strongest person I know. Some people don't see it, but I do. You always make sure I have food. You make me laugh when I feel scared. And you never let me feel alone. You are my hero. Love, Ethan. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I could almost picture him, small and determined, pressing down too hard on the pencil as he tried to spell every word right. That letter had been sitting here for years, quietly waiting for me to find it. In that moment, all the nights I stayed up working by candlelight, all the meals I skipped to make sure he ate, all the times I felt crushed by my father's words, they all dissolved into something else. It wasn't pain anymore. It was pride. When Ethan walked into the room and saw me holding the letter, he froze. His face turned red. "Mom, I didn't think you'd ever find that," he mumbled. I pulled him into my arms before he could say another word. "Do you know what this letter means to me?" I whispered. "It means that even when the world tried to erase me, you always saw me." "You've always been my reason," he hugged me back, his arms now broader, stronger than when he was a child. "I meant every word then," he said softly. "And I still do now. You showed me what strength looks like. That's why I know I'll be okay out there." I smiled through my tears, realizing that no amount of rejection from my family could compare to the acceptance in my son's eyes. They once called me the shame, but Ethan had always known the truth. That night, after he went to bed, I slipped the letter into my journal, between the pages where I had written my darkest thoughts and my brightest hopes. It felt like a bridge between the woman I used to be and the woman I had become. The world had once tried to define me as nothing. But my son's words reminded me of the only truth that mattered. To him, I had always been everything. The first gala for Harbor of Hope was held in Honolulu, in a modest hall overlooking the ocean. It wasn't the glamorous kind of event you see in magazines. No tuxedos, no glittering chandeliers. Just simple tables, strings of warm lights, and people whose lives had been touched by the foundation. As I stood by the stage preparing to thank the donors and volunteers, I noticed a young woman sitting quietly at one of the back tables. She looked nervous, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. When our eyes met, she gave me a tentative smile, but there was something in her gaze that felt heavy, almost desperate. After the speeches and applause faded, she approached me. Her voice shook. "Are you Rachel Monroe?" I nodded and she burst into tears. For a moment, I didn't know what to do, but then she reached for my hands. "You don't know me," she said between sobs, "but your foundation saved my life." She told me her name was Lily. She was a single mother, too, abandoned when her daughter was only a few months old. Bills piled up, rent overdue, no family willing to help. She had been days away from eviction when Harbor of Hope covered her housing for 3 months and connected her to a community of support. "I thought I was going to lose everything," she said, tears running down her face. "But because of you, I didn't. My daughter has a bed to sleep in. I have food to give her. And for the first time in months, I feel like I can breathe." Her words hit me like a wave. I had poured myself into Harbor of Hope, but hearing her story reminded me why. It wasn't about numbers on a screen or press releases. It was about real people, mothers like me, who had once sat alone in the dark, wondering if they could survive another day. I hugged her tightly, feeling her shoulders shake against mine. "You're not alone anymore, Lily," I whispered. "You're stronger than you think, and you don't ever have to fight this battle by yourself again." When we pulled apart, her little girl came running up, clutching a stuffed bear. She looked up at me with wide, curious eyes and said softly, "Thank you." That moment stayed with me long after the gala ended. Driving home with Ethan asleep in the passenger seat, I thought about how different my life had become. Once I had been the woman begging for a chance, praying for a miracle. Now, I was the one able to offer it to others. It struck me then. Revenge hadn't just been about cutting ties with my family. It had been about proving that their rejection couldn't define me. My real victory was standing there that night, seeing another mother's hope rekindled because I had turned my pain into purpose. The family I was born into had called me shame, but the family I was building looked at me and saw strength, and that was worth more than all the apologies in the world. It was late at night in Hawaii, long after Ethan had gone to bed. The house was quiet except for the sound of waves rolling against the shore. I sat alone on the balcony with a notebook in my lap, the same one I had carried for years. Its pages were filled with everything: business plans, numbers, angry scribbles from nights when I felt invisible, and tender notes I had written to myself when I needed to remember I was still here. That evening, I opened it to a blank page. For the first time, I wasn't writing to plan or to survive. I was writing to remember. My pen hovered before I finally began. I used to beg for love that was never given. I used to try to earn respect from people who never wanted to see me. I carried shame that was never mine. Tonight, I let all of that go. I paused, staring at the words, and then kept writing. I promised myself, never again will I shrink to fit into someone else's idea of who I should be. Never again will I silence my voice to keep peace that was never real. I am enough, exactly as I am. And I will live the rest of my life knowing my worth does not depend on anyone's approval. The ocean breeze tugged at the pages, almost like it wanted to carry the words away. But I pressed my hand down, keeping them safe, sealing them as my truth. I thought about my father's letter, Caroline's apology, Daniel's awkward phone call. Once, those things would have defined me. I would have replayed them, searching for validation, trying to squeeze meaning from words that always came too late. But not anymore. Their recognition, their regrets, they were no longer the measure of my life. The real measure sat sleeping in the next room, a boy who had grown up watching his mother fight, fall, rise, and keep moving forward. The real measure was Harbor of Hope, the mothers who now had a lifeline because I refused to stay silent. I closed the notebook and held it against my chest. For years, I had written to survive. Tonight, I wrote to be free. Standing, I stepped to the edge of the balcony. The moon hung bright over the ocean, silver light spilling across the waves. I whispered softly, not to anyone else, but to myself. This is my final revenge. Not anger, not bitterness, but living a life so full, so true that no one can take it away. I turned and glanced at the door to Ethan's room, a smile tugging at my lips. Tomorrow we would wake up and chase the sunrise together. Tomorrow I would keep my promise. Because the truth was simple now. I had stopped living for their approval and started living for my own. That was my story. The night my father threw me out of the house, the secret they never knew about my $94 million, and the moment I finally chose myself over a family that only saw me as their shame. If you've ever felt invisible in your own home, if you've ever carried the weight of being underestimated, I want you to remember this. You are not defined by what others say you are. You are defined by what you build, what you survive, and who you choose to become. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If this story moved you, please give it a like and share it with someone who might need the reminder that strength comes from within. And don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Family Revenge Stories, the place where family betrayal meets justice and where stories like mine prove that sometimes the best revenge is building a life no one can take away. I'm Rachel, and this was my final revenge. See you in the next video.